Mercedes just got exposed after Japan. And if this is confirmed, it changes the entire championship. Because what they're doing inside that engine could be worth up to 40 extra horsepower, without breaking a single rule. And here's the part nobody expected. Other teams knew about it. They complained. The FIA checked it. And still, Mercedes kept winning. 3 races. 3 victories. And a gap that should not exist under equal rules. So the real question is not if Mercedes is fast. It's this. Are they winning because they're better? Or because they found something nobody else can legally stop? Stay with me, because what happened after the Japanese Grand Prix just revealed a second advantage that might be even bigger. Subscribe now, because if you miss this, you miss the moment that could define the entire 2026 season. Mercedes didn't just win in Japan. They made something very clear. Their advantage is not accidental. Because when you look at the numbers from that race, they don't behave like a normal performance gap. They behave like something engineered. Something intentional. And here's where it starts to feel uncomfortable. On a track where precision matters more than raw speed, Mercedes was pulling away in sectors where they shouldn't dominate. Not just on straights. Not just in corners. Everywhere. And when engineers began comparing telemetry after the race, one pattern kept repeating. Mercedes wasn't just faster. They were consistently faster, lap after lap, without degradation. That's not just pace. That's control. But here's the detail most people missed. Because while everyone focused on lap times, teams were looking at something else entirely. Acceleration curves. Energy deployment. And more importantly, what happens right after full throttle? That tiny window? Where power delivery tells the truth. And in that window, Mercedes looked different. Smoother. Stronger. More efficient. Almost like the engine wasn't reacting, but predicting. And this is where things start connecting back to something much bigger. Because this behavior doesn't come from aerodynamics. It doesn't come from tires. It comes from the heart of the car. The power unit. But not just the obvious part. Not just combustion. There's another layer here. And most people ignored it, because the compression story was already big enough. But that's not the real issue. Not anymore. Because what teams are starting to realize after Japan is that even if you remove the compression advantage, Mercedes might still be ahead. And that changes everything. Because now the question is no longer, what is Mercedes doing? It becomes, how many things are they doing at the same time? And more importantly, which one is actually giving them the biggest edge? We'll come back to that, because the next detail is where this story really shifts. But the real shift after Japan didn't come from lap time. It came from something far more revealing. Data. Because once the race was over, teams went back, downloaded everything, and started comparing. Sector by sector. Throttle by throttle. Energy phase by energy phase. And at first, nothing looked illegal. Everything was within limits. Everything looked clean. But then one number stood out. Not publicly. Not on broadcasts. Inside engineering rooms. Mercedes was harvesting more energy than anyone else. Not slightly more. Significantly more. And this is where the story becomes much more serious. Because in 2026, energy is everything. You don't just drive fast. You manage deployment. You decide when to attack. When to defend. When to hold. And if you have more energy available per lap, you control the race. Not just your car. The race. Now think about that for a second. If Mercedes is generating more energy, that means they can deploy more energy. Longer. Stronger. More often. And suddenly, their straight-line speed makes sense. Their consistency makes sense. Even their tire management starts to make sense. Because they are not pushing harder. They are operating smarter. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because this advantage is not clearly regulated in the same way as compression. There is no simple number like 16-1. There is no obvious limit being crossed. Which means, even if the FIA removes the compression advantage in June, this part could stay. And that's what's starting to worry teams. Because they prepared to fight one battle. The compression battle. But now they're realizing, there might be a second one. And it might be even harder to challenge. Some engineers believe it's software. Others think it's thermal efficiency. Some point to how the engine and chassis are working together as one system. Not separate components. One integrated machine. And if that's true, then Mercedes didn't just find a loophole. They built an ecosystem. A design where heat, energy, and performance all feed each other. And that kind of advantage doesn't disappear with a rule change. It evolves. And here's the uncomfortable part. Because right now, nobody has filed an official protest about this. Not Ferrari. Not Honda. Not anyone. And that tells you something. They don't fully understand it yet. And in Formula 1, what you don't understand, you can't stop. So while the world is focused on compression, Mercedes might already be one step ahead. Again. And if that's true, then June won't level the field. It might just reveal how far ahead they really are. And this is where everything starts pointing to one moment. June. Because up until now, Mercedes has been operating inside a protected window. A window everyone agreed to. A window that, quietly, allowed this advantage to exist. But that window is about to close. From that point forward, engines will no longer be tested the way they were before. No more ideal conditions. No more cold measurements. Everything will be checked under real temperature, real stress, real behavior. Exactly where Mercedes built their edge. And on paper, that should hurt them. It should reduce power. It should close the gap. It should give Ferrari, Honda, and the rest a way back in. But here's the detail nobody can answer yet. How much of Mercedes' dominance actually comes from that compression trick? Because if you look at Japan, the gap was massive. Over half a second per lap at times. And even the most aggressive estimates say the compression advantage explains only a fraction of that. A fraction. So let's be honest about what that means. Even if you remove it completely, Mercedes is still ahead. And that's the part that changes everything. Because now June is no longer a reset. It's a reveal. A moment where the illusion disappears. And only the real performance remains. And teams know it. That's why behind closed doors, they are not celebrating the rule change. They are preparing for disappointment. Because if Mercedes stays ahead after June, then this was never about one trick. It was about something much deeper. Something structural. Something designed from the very beginning of the project. And this is where the pressure starts to build. On Ferrari, to respond. On Red Bull, to understand why their version didn't work. On the FIA, to make sure they didn't miss something even bigger. Because if another advantage is hiding inside that car, and nobody acts in time, this championship could be decided before the fight even begins. But there's one final layer to this story, one that almost nobody is talking about publicly. Because it doesn't show up in headlines. It doesn't trigger protests. It doesn't even look suspicious at first glance. And yet, it might be the one detail that explains everything. Because there is one last piece, and it doesn't look like an advantage at all. At least, not at first. It looks like stability. It looks like consistency. It looks like a car that simply never falls off. But in Formula 1, that's never accidental. After Japan, engineers started focusing on something even more subtle. Not peak performance. But what happens over time. Lap after lap. Stint after stint. Because most cars degrade. Power fluctuates. Energy drops. Temperatures spike. Performance fades. But Mercedes doesn't. Or at least, not in the same way. Their performance curve is different. Flatter. More controlled. Almost resistant to the usual patterns every other team is fighting. And this is where the final question begins to form. What if the real advantage is not how much power they produce, but how long they can sustain it? Because if your engine delivers slightly more power, that's useful. But if your entire system allows you to maintain optimal performance for longer than anyone else, that's domination. And suddenly, everything connects. The compression advantage gives them extra power. The energy recovery gives them more deployment. But this gives them control over the entire race distance. And that's something no regulation directly limits. You can cap numbers. You can define ratios. You can measure temperature. But controlling how stable a system is over time, that's design. That's philosophy. That's where engineering becomes strategy. And if Mercedes has truly mastered that, then what we are seeing is not a loophole. It's a complete understanding of the new era. A car built not just to be fast, but to stay fast. No drops. No weak phases. No vulnerability windows. And that's why Japan felt different. Because it wasn't just a win. It was a demonstration. A controlled display of something other teams couldn't interrupt. Couldn't respond to. Couldn't even fully explain. And now, everything leads to one final realization. Because if you take away the noise, the controversy, the politics, the arguments, what remains is simple. Mercedes didn't just find an advantage. They found multiple. They layered them. They connected them. And they built a car that operates in a space where every small gain amplifies the next. And that leads to the question that defines everything. When June arrives, and the rules finally catch up, will anything actually change? Or will that moment expose something even more uncomfortable? That Mercedes was never ahead because of one trick, but because they understood the rules better than everyone else. And now, we arrive at the part nobody wants to say out loud. Because if everything we've seen so far is true, then the biggest controversy is not the engine. It's the timing. Think about it. Mercedes knew exactly how the FIA was measuring the engine. They knew the tests were done cold. They knew the real performance only appeared under heat. And they built an entire concept around that gap. Not by accident. Not as a side effect. But as a starting point. And that changes how you look at the entire project. Because this wasn't a clever fix. It wasn't a late discovery. This was planned, from the beginning. Before the first race. Before the first test. Before anyone else even realized what was possible. And that's why the other teams are really frustrated. Not because Mercedes found something. But because they didn't. Because now they're not just chasing performance. They're chasing an idea they didn't see in time. And in Formula One, that's the worst position you can be in. Late. Now here's where the story becomes even more uncomfortable. Because officially, everything is legal. Every win counts. Every point stands. Nothing will be taken away. But internally, that's not how teams are looking at it. They are already calculating the damage. 6 races. Full advantage. Maximum points. A lead that could define the entire season. And even if the gap closes later, you don't erase those results. You don't replay those races. You don't get a second chance. So the real impact of this trick is not just performance. It's timing. It's when that performance exists. And who benefits from it first. Because by the time June arrives, it might already be too late. Too late for Ferrari to recover. Too late for Red Bull to fix their concept. Too late for anyone to stop the momentum Mercedes has already built. And that leads to the final realization. The one everything has been building toward. Mercedes didn't just create a faster engine. They didn't just exploit a regulation. They didn't just out-engineer their rivals. They out-timed them. They found a window, used it perfectly, and turned it into a championship advantage before anyone could react. And now, even if that window closes, the question is no longer whether Mercedes was legal, or whether the advantage was fair. The real question is much simpler. Did they already win the championship? Before the rules had a chance to catch up?